Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Nakon raspada Sovjetskog saveza, međusobni odnosi centralnoazijskih država godinama su bili uglavnom loši zbog sporova oko granica i resursa. Danas sve države Centralne Azije slijede multivektorski pristup u vanjskoj politici, pri čemu nastoje održati ravnotežu u odnosima sa Rusijom, Kinom, Europskom unijom i SAD-om, Turskom i Iranom. Sa obzirom na talibansko preuzimanje vlasti u Afganistanu 2021. godine, Centralna Azija postala je ključna za stabilnost i sigurnost većih država poput Rusije i Kine. Međutim, prošlogodišnja izjava kazahstanskog predsjednika Kasim-Džomrata Tokajeva o nepriznavanju Donjecka i Luganska razbjesnila je mnoge u Kremlju i izazvala je priče o ruskoj invaziji i na Kazakhstan, gdje se nalazi vojna baza Bajkonur za lansiranje raketa u svemir. Kakva je strateška važnost Centralne Azije za Rusiju, Kinu, ali i Tursku, analiziramo u ovom izdanju emisije. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo uvodnu grafiku. Nadmetanje za utjecaj u Centralnoj Aziji traje decenijama, čak i stoljećima. Nedugo nakon što su Kazahstan, Kirgistan, Tadžikistan, Turkmenistan i Uzbekistan stekli nezavisnost krajem 1991. godine, pojavili su se strani akteri. Na prvom mjestu je svakako Rusija. Rusija je od ranog 19. vijeka imala najjači utjecaj u Centralnoj Aziji i nastavila je to u godinama nakon obnove njihove nezavisnosti. Mnogi ljudi u tom području i dalje govore ruski. Ruska televizija se gleda na mnogim mjestima, dok milioni ljudi odlaze da rade u Rusiju, odakle šalju novčane doznake koje se ne samo da pomažu porodicama kod kuće, već održavaju i ekonomije tih zemalja. 30 godina nakon nezavisnosti, Centralna Azija ponovno postaje evroazijsko trgovinsko čvorište i mnogo se proizvoda kopnenim putem transportuje iz Kine i Rusije prema Centralnoj Aziji i obratno. Moskva ima i vojne baze u Kirgistanu i Tadžikistanu. Povratak Talibana na vlast u Afganistanu pružio je Kremlju priliku da uvjeri vlade zemalja Centralne Azije u Rusiju kao garanta sigurnosti u tom regionu. Osim Rusije, tu je i Kina, koja je među prvim državama priznala nezavisnost zemalja Centralne Azije, uspostavivši diplomatske veze sa svih 5 država u januaru 1992. godine. Međutim, mape i školski udžbenici u Kini prikazuju velike dijelove Centralne Azije kao historijske dijelove Kine, što je izazvalo zabrinutost u toj regiji. Kina je danas postala vodeći trgovinski partner svake države Centralne Azije i mnogi od najvećih projekata izvedenih u proteklih 20 godina, posebno infrastrukturni, ne bi bili mogući bez financijske podrške Pekinga. Kina više ne mora trošiti milijarde dolara na projekte u Centralnoj Aziji. Deseci milijuna dolara su dovoljni da Centralna Azija bude ovisna o kineskom finansiranju. To nije mnogo novca za Kinu, ali jeste za tu regiju, posebno za siromašnije zemlje poput Kirgistana i Tadžikistana. Te zemlje su ušle u dužničku zamku Kine, koja je dovela do toga da Tadžikistan, na primjer, otplati dio svog duga davanjem koncesija kineskim firmama za rudarenje. Brutalan odnos Pekinga prema muslimanima, uglavnom Ujgurima, ali i etničkim Kazasima u zapadnom kineskom regionu Xinjiang, također izaziva ogorčenost u Centralnoj Aziji. I na kraju tu je i Turska, koja je proteklih godina pojačala svoje aktivnosti u tom dijelu svijeta. Turski predsjednik Turgut Özal bio je zagovornik panturcizma. On je u aprilu 1993. godine obišao Kazahstan, Kirgistan, Turkmenistan i Uzbekistan, poslavši poruku o turskom bratstvu. Ta poruka je naišla na dobar prijem. Özal je međutim ubrzo preminuo, a Turska nije bila u poziciji da investira veće sume novca potrebne Centralnoj Aziji. Nedavno je Turska povećala svoju ulogu u globalnoj politici, koja je dovela do toga da Ankara pokaže svoje mišiće u Siriji, Libiji i Azerbejdžanu. Ankara je stvorila i organizaciju turkijskih država. Članovi te organizacije su Turska, Azerbejdžan, Kazakhstan, Kirgistan i Uzbekistan sa Turkmenistanom i Mađarskom kao državama posmatračima. Turska je prirodni saveznik turkofonskih država Centralne Azije, ali i Kavkaza. Ankara je za njih najpoželjniji partner ne samo zbog kulturne i jezičke bliskosti, već i zbog uloge Turske u međunarodnoj politici. Prijateljstvo sa Turskom daje još jednog snažnog partnera koji pomaže u balansiranju odnosa sa Rusijom i Kinom. Idemo sada slikom do Taškenta, odakle nam se uključuje Samuel Doveri Vesterbye, stručnjak za odnose Evropske unije i Centralne Azije. Samuel, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking any time to speak to us. Now, you're currently in Uzbekistan. How does Moscow view the impact and implications of a drawdown by NATO forces over the last 1.5 years from Afghanistan for its own security and its interest in Central Asia and its role in that part of the world?
I think everyone sees the removal of the United States from Afghanistan as a major security problem, in the sense that now, of course, the Taliban is led by many factions. The Taliban is a divided entity. Some factions are extremely radical, some are more moderate. The ones in Kabul, of course, represent a more moderate force, but some in other provinces and regions have a far more radical understanding of a whole range of policies that deeply impact the region's security, as well as potential for peace, connectivity, and so forth. And of course, Russia is always concerned, as everyone else, about the implications of this. And of course, Russia has a long-standing interest in providing north-south trade and corridors going from Moscow and Russia down to Central Asia into Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India in order to diversify its trade routes, which are now more blocked going towards Europe. So Russia specifically has a vested interest, which actually has less to do specifically with the Taliban and the issues I mentioned before, but even more just to do with diversifying its own trade corridors and connectivity.
Right. Well, as far as the EU is concerned, what are the EU's interests in Central Asia, and have they been changing ever since Russia invaded Ukraine a year ago?
I would say the EU's interest in Central Asia is primarily, of course, to build a strong Central Asian and united Central Asian region. For a very, very long period of time, countries like Russia, but also others, have played a divide and rule policy in Central Asia. And the EU, which of course consists of small and medium-sized countries like Turkey, like Belgium, like Spain, like Uzbekistan, these are small and medium-sized countries. They care about creating unions of small and medium-sized countries that can respond to superpower threat and can respond to actions like Russia's divide and conquer approach. So that's really the main ambition of the EU. And then the second ambition of the EU is, of course, to fulfill its multi-corridor foreign policy. The EU is interested not in having one corridor, for example, a transatlantic corridor or a corridor to China or a corridor through the Middle East. It's interested in having multi-corridors. That means supply chains, critical raw materials, trade with the Central Asians, with the Middle East, with North Africa, and so on. And so in that respect, countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan are very important in terms of consumer markets, critical raw materials for hydrogen development, as well as critical raw materials for green energy transition for solar plants and so forth, and as well as also just for the diversification of supply chains for a general amount of goods.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, Central Asia is, you mentioned the Middle East, it's connected to the Middle East in a way through Turkey. Turkey acts as a bridge. And I want to ask you, to what extent have developments and civil strife in the Middle East over the last couple of years been prompting a rethink in Moscow's Central Asian strategy?
I mean, I think Moscow is increasingly showing isolation. And as a result, its traditional corridors or avenues of trade and alliances in the Middle East have become more difficult or precarious. So, for example, it, of course, has a strong relationship with Syria under Bashar al-Assad, but Turkey stands in its way of having a direct corridor when it comes to, of course, Iran, a traditional and increasing ally of Russia in the Middle East. The barrier remains Azerbaijan, which, of course, and Georgia as well, which are countries that lay in between the Russian Federation and its Middle Eastern allies. So if you look at it from that kind of basic geographic point of view, Central Asia becomes very relevant for the Russian Federation in the sense that it is a potential corridor, it's a potential connected route that leads down to the Middle East.
But would you say, I mean, when you look at things from a broader perspective, would you say that Central Asia today is still ruled by Moscow's allies, or are you beginning to notice any changes over the last 2 years? I'm specifically referring to last year's statements by Tajik President Emomali Rahman.
We're seeing big changes in Central Asia. The aggressive war of Russia in Ukraine has direct spillover effects. A country like Kazakhstan, which for the longest period of time has been heavily intertwined with the Russian Federation, is now showing really strong signs of distancing itself. So it's obvious that a country that shares a border with the Russian Federation and sees what Russia is doing in Ukraine is starting to fear who could be next and what implications it could have for Kazakhstan, a sovereign country in its own right, and so forth. So when it comes especially to the energy sector and to trade, countries like Kazakhstan are trying to diversify away, and that's something that both China and the EU are supporting, because the East-West corridor is one, the middle corridor is of course one that would allow the Central Asian republics to diversify away from only being reliant on Russia. Mm-hmm. Of course, as you correctly mentioned yourself, we saw those statements by the Tajik president, which were unusual to say the least, in the sense that you don't normally see presidents at that level express themselves so candidly against Putin. And so I think that's a trend that you're absolutely right about.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what is the medium-term outlook for Sino-Russian relations in the region, particularly if Beijing seeks to shift gear from mainly being an economic actor in the region to having a more pronounced military and political role?
I mean, China is expanding its military presence in the region. It conducted 12 military and joint anti-terrorism exercises with Central Asia over the past decade. China has boosted its arms sales something like 8-fold between 2015 and 2019. So it's definitely, it has a strong presence, not only economically, but also in terms of military and security development. Russia is taking a backseat. It's of course very, very busy with the terrible conflict in Ukraine. And we also saw that Kazakhstan was not so interested in the continued presence of Collective Security Treaty Organization troops in Kazakhstan last year. And so that is showing us very much that, number one, China is taking a strong position, but that there are also other actors which are very interested in the region in order both to protect their investments, but also to guarantee stability in the region. And those include Turkey and the EU, both from a trade perspective, but also through things like the Organization of Turkic States.
Well, Samuel, it was very interesting talking to you. Thank you once again for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Taškenta nam se uključuje Doveri Vesterbye, stručnjak za odnose Evropske unije i Centralne Azije. Centralnoazijske države suočavaju se sa direktnim posljedicama invazije na Ukrajinu. Rusija neće moći nastaviti sa velikim građevinskim projektima koji zahtijevaju veliki broj radnika i migranata iz Centralne Azije. To će povećati probleme sa nezaposlenošću u regiji. Nivo novčanih doznaka iz Rusije također se smanjuje, što predstavlja pritisak na ekonomije zemalja Centralne Azije. Peking je signalizirao spremnost da pruži pomoć za unutrašnju stabilnost i podršku ekonomskoj sigurnosti. Idemo slikom do Cambridgea u državi Massachusetts gdje se nalazi R Saivetz, sigurnosna savjetnica na MIT-u. Carol, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is perhaps the most egregious example of Russia's determination to use force to ensure that its periphery bows to its wishes. Should Central Asian states be worried, bearing in mind Vladimir Putin's aspirations for a Russian-dominated Eurasian order?
It's very interesting. It's a great question. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea and after the beginning of the fighting in the Donbass, Kazakhstan particularly was was very concerned and watching very carefully because a good percentage of the population in Kazakhstan, especially in the northern part of the country contiguous to Russia, is ethnically Russian. And there were veiled hints and not so veiled hints that that Russia might be interested in stirring up trouble there. And of course, in several of the other states, both in Central Asia and in the Caucasus, there are pockets of Russian speakers and of ethnic Russians whom Russia at that point purported to be wanting to protect.
Mm-hmm. So would you take, if you were a Kazakh, would you be worried about Russian irredentist aspirations towards your territory?
I would have been more worried in 2014 than I am today. I think that today, with the war in Ukraine not going Russia's way, that the Kazakhs can breathe half a sigh of relief and say, well, okay, we're not in the crosshairs at the moment. I've just done some research that indicates that Russia's grip, let me put it that way, that Russia's grip on the Caucasus and on the Central Asian states seems to be weakening somewhat because they are so preoccupied with what is going on in Ukraine.
Now, do you see signs of erosion in relations and trust between Central Asian leaders and President Vladimir Putin? I'm particularly referring to Tajik President Emomali Rahman, who not too long ago publicly berated President Vladimir Putin for not showing enough respect towards Central Asian states and for treating them as if they were still part of the Soviet Union.
Well, it's really interesting. If you look at last fall, as things were deteriorating for the Russians in Ukraine, fighting broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan and between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And in both cases, the Russians proved incapable, unwilling to get involved to try to mediate until things really blew out of control. And that's the point at which Rahmon said, yeah, you're treating us like vassals, like we were still part of the Soviet Union. And the Kyrgyz were also very annoyed at the Russians and canceled some joint military exercises. And Armenia is lost, if you will. Armenia feels very much isolated because Azerbaijan is the superior military force, and because Russia does not seem to be coming to Armenia's assistance.
Right, so you pointed out the examples of Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. So in that case, what is the effectiveness, if any, of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO?
I would argue none at the moment.
None,
it's
right?
Very interesting. Last January, a little more than a year ago, before the war in Ukraine broke out, the CSTO was deployed for the first time to Kazakhstan to help the president remain in power. And people like me who were watching the scene said, oh my God, Kazakhstan has basically just caved to Russian influence, etc. And then the war in Ukraine broke out. And if you look over the last year, Kazakhstan has really tried to pursue an intermediate path, if you will. And the CSTO at the moment, Armenia also canceled CSTO maneuvers and lamented the fact, like, what good is it if it didn't protect us from Azerbaijani attack? And the same thing for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. It's just, it doesn't seem to be doing anything and was deployed that one time to keep Japarov in power.
Right. So do you see a possibility for the US, maybe China, making inroads now that Russia is more focused on Ukraine? I mean, I remember back in the 1990s, there was a lot of US interest for Central Asian states, but I have a feeling this has been dwindling over the recent years.
I think particularly after 9/11, we were very interested in the Central Asian states. After all, we had bases both in Uzbekistan until 2005 and in Kyrgyzstan until more recently. And then, of course, the United States, as you indicated, basically lessened its interest in that part of the world. I think we're still interested, but it's probably the Chinese who will benefit most from Russia's loosening of its grasp on the region. After all, they are still there. They are contiguous to the region, and they have huge economic investments in the Central Asian states.
Right. More recently, we've seen how certain states in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Central Asia have been continuing to permit the transshipment of sanctioned goods from the West and from around the world towards Russia. Can Russia evade Western sanctions this way?
I think they're doing a good job of it, to be honest. There's an article even in today's Financial Times talking about how the EU is about to crack down on this huge increase in imports on the part of the states you just listed, and then they're re-exporting those goods to Russia. And it struck me that perhaps one of the ways that Kazakhstan can be rhetorically independent of Russia, maybe not so worried about Russia stirring up trouble among the Russian-speaking population in Kazakhstan, is precisely because they're allowing the transshipment of their consumer goods, but the Russians, according to reports, are raiding them for the computer chips that are in them in order to pursue the war in Ukraine.
Right. And finally, I mean, it's been more than 30 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. Each of these former Soviet states has been, choosing and treading its own path forward. Do you expect Moscow to retain its interest in former, Soviet republics, particularly in Central Asia, after the war in Ukraine ends?
I think it'll depend on how the war in Ukraine ends. If it ends in a stalemate where Russia is still pursuing its interests and is still involved militarily in some way, shape, or form, I think probably less so. I think if it ends in Moscow's favor, I think then we'll see sort of a renewal of interest in these other states. I mean, after all, it really seems to me that Putin has a rather sort of Russian nationalist / imperialist mindset. And one of Putin's main advisors wrote 20 some odd years ago that Russia cannot be a great power until it is the regional hegemon first. And so I do think that that is one of Putin's goals.
Right. Carol, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Cambridgea u Massachusettsu nam se uključila R Saivetz, sigurnosna savjetnica MIT-a. Zbog ruske invazije na Ukrajinu i koncentracije vojnih snaga na tom frontu, utjecaj Moskve u Srednjoj Aziji polako slabiji. Stotine ruskih vojnika je povučeno iz vojnih baza u Kirgistanu i Taškentanu i prebačeno u Ukrajinu. Međutim, Rusija i dalje ostaje ključni sigurnosni, politički i kulturološki faktor u toj regiji. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.